So let's talk about Kiwi culture. New Zealand is essentially a westernized culture with some Polynesian influences. It's influenced by the location, also by the successive waves of immigrants that have come to the shores. Obviously the Polynesians, the Maoris, and now we talk about the Pakeha culture, which is the European culture that came in the 1800s. The Polynesians explored throughout the entire Polynesian Triangle, from New Zealand, which makes up the southwestern corner, to Hawaii all the way to Easter Island. And New Zealand was the last landmass that was populated by the peoples of Polynesia. They say between 1250 and 1300 Common Era, which would be AD. And most of the researchers believe that it was around 1280 that most of them started to arrive in Polynesia or in New Zealand. The Maori established their tribes, they built fortified villages, they hunted and they fished, they traded commodities, they developed agriculture, arts and weaponry, and they kept a very interesting, detailed oral history. Thankfully, they've maintained this oral history over generations, where most cultures lose that over successive generations. The Maoris have been able to maintain that and maintain the rich tapestry of their oral tradition through mythology as well. European contact began in 1800, and British immigration proceeded rapidly, especially from 1855. Colonists had a dramatic effect on the Maori community. They brought Christianity, they brought advanced technology, the English language, and they insisted upon literacy. In 1840, the Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi. You're going to be arriving in Waitangi. Some of you will be able to go and to see the grounds where they signed that treaty. And the treaty really was intended to enable the tribes to live peacefully with the colonists. In the end, what it ended up doing is something quite different. After several incidents, the New Zealand Wars broke out from 1845, with Maori suffering a loss of land. Now, this was loss of land that was taken from them, but it also resulted in extensive land sales. So, while the British didn't necessarily steal all of the land, the Maori felt compelled to sell. They wanted the things that the British had. And of course, when you have something all of your life, this land, you don't think about the true price for selling it. And so they sold this land relatively inexpensively to the British, who then dispossessed them of their land. So it was sold for a pittance. The people sold their lands and were left then with very little, because they are people of the land. That means, Maori means people of the land, Tangata Whenua. So the Maori retained their identity, mostly choosing to live separately from the colonists. And in this way, they were able to maintain their culture over the past 200 years. With mass migration from Britain, a high Maori death rate, and a low life expectancy for Maori women, the indigenous population dropped between 1850 and 1930, making the Maori a distinct minority. Maori culture, when we talk about Maori culture, we talk about the indigenous peoples of New Zealand. They were the original settlers from the Polynesian islands, and they arrived between 1250 and 1300. They settled many of the islands and developed a distinct culture over several hundred years. One of the great stories is about this long migration, the story of this great hero who came from Hawaiki, Hawaiki being the name of their mythological homeland. So when they talk about this Hawaiki, which was over on the horizon. They don't know where that came from, but the indigenous peoples believed that they all came from this one source, Hawaiki. What they didn't know is that Hawaiki was more than likely Taiwan. Maori mythology includes many gods and heroes. many that are common throughout Polynesia. So you'll see throughout Maori culture, you'll see many of the same gods. You'll see Maui, which will be a very important demigod. In fact, Maui was the one who pulled up the islands of New Zealand from the ocean. This is a marae. We'll be able to see a marae like this when we are, probably many of you will go to a marae visit when you're in Rotorua. This is where the tribes and families gather for special occasions. It's a very, very distinctive looking building. There is a very specific protocol that we'll discuss, and when you arrive and you go to the marae, there's a very specific protocol that you need to follow as a guest in the marae. This is a group of children dressing up like adult Maoris in traditional wear. The tattoos, the mokus, this is obviously just drawn on their children, but it's a great photo to illustrate how the children learn from their parents this dress. Maori call themselves tangata wheneva, or people of the land. And this is placing importance that they are the rightful heirs, the rightful possessors of the land and the sea. They believe in communal living and sharing and living off the land. These are all part of their traditional strong values. The distinct values and history of the Maori are described also and are shown through some of their arts. The haka, I'll be showing you in a little bit the haka, which is a warrior dance. Whenever you arrive at a marae, the men will put on this dance that is meant to intimidate the visitors. It's meant to show their strength and to show that they really are a warrior tribe. They've prided themselves on being a dominant warrior tribe. So the haka is one of those dances that shows that. Tamoku, which is the tattoo, primarily the female face tattoo. Many of the men in ancient times will show you with photos or drawings of the men's tattoos all around their faces. And the men will also have tattoos throughout their bodies. The women generally only had tattoos from this part of their mouth down their chin. And you'll see some of that. And those are permanent tattoos that you see on many of these women. It's part of the way of showing a woman in the tribe that she belongs to the tribe, that she is a person who pertains to this particular tribe. And it tells specific things about where they belong. The Vayata is a commemorative song, so when you arrive, they will sing a song that's a welcome song, and it also tells about their tribal history. Then there's carving and weaving and poi. Many of you know poi as the kind of the pasty substance that comes from Hawaii, but the poi actually in Maori is a dance that is done with balls on the end of a string, and it's a very interesting dance. I don't have time to show you today, but if you get a chance to go online to see some of the dancing, and you may actually see it while you're in New Zealand as well. The concept of tapu is also very strong, and you're going to see this now. We're going to continue to see this name over and over again. And for those of you who got off the boat and went ashore in Tonga, you know, the name of that island was Tonga Tapu. So that meant sacred, set aside, reverent Tonga. And so when we see that name Tapu, it's important to continue to keep that in mind, that what they're talking about is something that's set aside, it's sacred. And so in Maori culture, this idea of tapu or taboo is applied to objects, peoples, houses, mountains, cemeteries, many different places that can be considered taboo or tapu. Now you're going to see this word uniquely referring to the Europeans who came to New Zealand, and they're still referred to this today. It's called Pakeha culture, Pakeha. And so Pakeha refers to the British, particularly the English settlers who colonized New Zealand in the 19th century. And it's a term that's still used today. Many of the British, when they arrived, really retained and tried to retain their connections to Mother England. But after a while, after the British Empire began to dwindle, and they were unable to get their British meat and their cheeses anymore, this distance between and their connection to their homeland started to dwindle. They lived a largely rural life, and so consequently when we think of New Zealanders, I think most of us already have in our mind that New Zealanders would be rugged types of people, right? These are people who can handle themselves on the land. They're people of the land. They're also egalitarian people. They pride themselves on having a classless system. but there's also some subclasses too. So when we talk about Pakeha, it's not just the British. Now it has grown to include anyone who is not Maori. So whether it's Irish or Italian or other European groups, all of those people would be considered part of Pakeha culture. So the Pakeha began to forge a separate identity in reference to the Maori, that they were a very specific group of people. They lived a rural lifestyle, and they grew to dominate New Zealand's environment. Pakeha culture became prevalent after the wars, and they started to really distinguish themselves apart from the Maori. And they really wanted to show themselves as not just a dominant force militarily and the people who had taken over the culture. They wanted to introduce their own cultural traits. More recently, New Zealand has been hit by a wave of globalization, much like the rest of the world. At the same time, this is also happening in New Zealand, but in a little bit different way. From the mid-20th century on, waves of immigrants entered this society, and what was once a bicultural society has now become a very multicultural society. In the 1950s, the Dutch and the Central Europeans arrived. In the 1960s, the Pacific Islanders arrived. And then in the 1980s, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Southeast Asians arrived. And this has created a very strong multicultural society in New Zealand. This is a great photo that shows the celebration for Chinese New Year. And in Auckland, there will be often festivals celebrating the many different groups that come to New Zealand shores, including the Indians, the Chinese, and even Maori, and other Pacific Island groups, well as Tongans, Samoans. All of them have places in the calendar for their special events. What's unique about New Zealand is that it is an isolated nation. It is the most isolated temperate landmass in the world. It's so distant that it was the last landmass to be settled by Polynesians, them arriving only 700 years ago. So when we consider that Australia had indigenous peoples arriving 50 to 65,000 years ago, and New Zealand only had people arriving on their shores 700 years ago. The islands of Hawaii, the islands of New Zealand, the islands of Easter Island, and the other Polynesian island groups were all peopled prior to New Zealand. You can see here in distances where Auckland is located, New Zealand's located, and how far it takes to get to some of these other locations. Even Sydney itself is still a 3.5-hour flight away. So it's quite a distance when we consider where New Zealand is located. New Zealand's also geographically spread out. So what you'll find in New Zealand is that there are very few large cities, and throughout the country there are very few cities, period. You'll find small villages interspersed, but for the most place, this is small towns interspersed with large swaths of land in between. And it's really gonna make you fall in love with New Zealand. I live in Costa Rica now, but if New Zealand was located a little bit closer to the United States, I can tell you that that's where I would have chosen as my home. It is like living in a national park. I remember being in college there and walking around, and if I didn't feel like riding my bike and didn't feel like walking 40 miles, I could just put my thumb out and hitch a ride just about anywhere I wanted to go and feel completely safe. And in successive visits over the past 25, 30 years, nothing has changed. New Zealand is as beautiful and as friendly and as lovely as it was the day that I went to school there 30 years ago, and I'm sure that you're going to love it. When we do a comparison, the UK is about the same size as New Zealand, and yet the UK has 63 million people, and New Zealand has 4 million people. So it's even fewer people than, say, Costa Rica, which is the size of West Virginia. New Zealand's even larger, and they have the same population as Costa Rica. It's isolated but connected. What you'll find here, and you'll see this across many of the islands, many of these islands and the people here actually received cell phones before they actually had home phones. New Zealand has had phones for a long time. They're very well connected. They have a strong internet grid, a strong power grid. But these are people who really are early adopters to technology. They want to be connected. They recognize their disconnectedness from the world, and they want to be connected. So they're very strong users of the internet. We'll talk briefly about some syncretism, which is this blending of Pakeha and Maori cultures. From the 1830s, Maori nominally were converted to Christianity. And in the process, they learned to read and write. At that point in time, the Maori were as likely to be literate as the Pakeha, which was interesting because when we consider that the people that they were sending over from Britain, these were not the most educated people. And so when they sent the missionaries over, the missionaries were training the Maori to read and to write. And so over a short period of time, the Maori actually became as literate, if not more literate, than the people that Britain was sending over to manage the resources there. A number of religions, such as Maori and Ringatu, developed in the 19th century, blending Maori tradition and Christianity. We'll see this throughout the world. For those of you who are students of ancient faiths and recent faiths, this idea of syncretism, we see this in Cuba with the blending of the Yoruba people from West Africa and Catholicism, forming the blend of Santeria. You'll see this in the Caribbean as well, in Haiti, where we have the Catholic faith and then the West African beliefs coming over, the French mixture in there, blending this and becoming voodoo or voodoo. So we see these syncretic faiths around the world, and so these faiths of Maori and Ringatu are similar. These are the blendings of Maori culture and Christianity. In music, Maori traditional chants were put to Victorian music or written in European tunes, and many of the designs that you'll see today, the Maori wood carvers, who are traditional carvers, learned how to produce artwork and woodwork that would be acceptable to the Pakeha culture. Maori also altered their style. They used British fabrics to create their own dress styles. And from the 1820s, they even started to create their boats. So they stopped creating their Maori vakas, the canoes, and they started creating European boats. So they really wanted to blend in, but they still managed to hold on to their strong traditions. In time, their idea of wanting to become and to partner with the Pakeha culture really wasn't their choice any longer. As the British continued to arrive, they began to outnumber the Maori. Parliament passed legislation affecting the Maori, such as the Native Schools Act, which forced them to practice and to learn English, although this was not very widely enforced. They were learning, however, that it made good sense for them to integrate themselves into the European and British society. They understood that it was beneficial for them to get a college education, to learn the Pakeha ways, to learn English, and to become a part of society so that they could better their tribes and better their people. So they started to become less involved in their own culture when, gosh, they were able to have television, they were able to have electricity, lights, telephones, radio, airplane, all of these things. They started to move away from their cultural heritage. Thankfully, they've been able to retain that, and they have come back to it. From the early 20th century, especially from the 1970s, the Maori activists began to protest what they saw was an unequal balance of power in New Zealand. As we see in most native cultures throughout the world, the dominant culture is the colonizing culture, and it's very difficult for the subjugated people, for the native peoples, to have their rights. And at some point, the Maori recognized this, and they decided that it was time for them to demand equal recognition for their culture. And I'm very pleased to tell you that that's part of what's happened in New Zealand. There's such a beautiful, loving respect between the Pakeha culture and the Maori culture that I have not seen in all of my travels, I haven't seen it anywhere else in the world where people really respect each other's culture as much as they do in New Zealand. The Pakeha borrowed from Maori culture, and you'll also see that the Maori culture borrowed from Pakeha culture. And I'm going to show you now an example, a really great video from the All Blacks, the rugby team, and how when they play all over the world, they have adopted the Maori haka, so this dance, this positioning, to show them as a warrior tribe. And so if you get a chance to see one of their games, this is what you'll see. I actually was when I was at the University of the South Pacific, they would come over and play. The All Blacks would come over and practice because they couldn't get any privacy in New Zealand, so they would come over to Fiji and practice on the university campus. So we were often able to see them and sit out and have our sandwiches and watch the All Blacks play. It was quite a treat. In the same way, the Maori now have their cultures adopted by the Pakeha culture. So European society has also adopted many of the Maori traits and experiences, particularly in tourism. You'll see this a great deal, that much of what is considered New Zealand is very much has its origins in the Maori culture. So they began to be a little bit upset, however, when the Pakeha culture began to adopt things without asking or using them in disrespectful ways. And most Pakeha now are very respectful of Maori culture, but you'll also see that the Maoris now have also adopted some of their songs and music and put some American and other European music to their words. And so what I'm going to show you right now is this beautiful rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody in Maori. It's a little long. I apologize that the lecture goes over, but I really want you to see this. Isn't that beautiful? My favorite part is that Mamma Mia sounds the same in every language, right? So New Zealand has 3 official languages. English is the primary language. Maori language and New Zealand Sign Language also have official status. And then some of the other languages are spoken by the immigrant community. So you'll have Tongan dialects, you'll have Samoan dialects, and many of the other native groups. New Zealand English is close to Australian English, but they say now that it's actually closer to the southern dialect, or the dialect of southern England, more so than Australia. So one thing that you'll learn in Australia, and hopefully you'll learn it before you get there, is that they really don't appreciate comparisons to Australia. So as much as you might be tempted to make comparisons when you're speaking with a Kiwi or New Zealander, try not to make those comparisons because they don't really appreciate them. But 96% of the population speaks English in New Zealand. So folks, you're going to be in good shape, and I apologize if you find one of the 3 or 3.9% that doesn't speak English. Te Reo Maori is the Eastern Polynesian language. It's closely related to Tahitian and to the Cook Islands Maori. The language went into decline following the European colonization, but it's been growing in use since the 1970s. They've seen quite an uptick in this speaking of Maori through a program called Kahangaroa. And Kahangaroa is a program that's been implemented in schools to help children reconnect with their native heritage. So there's also, you can see that there was a Maori Language Act in 1987, and there's also a Maori Language Week and a Maori television channel. So for those of you who are interested in really getting into Maori, you can actually turn on the television and your satellite at home and look up the Maori television channel. In 2013, they determined about 3.74% of the population is Maori. Religion is an interesting topic in New Zealand. Most of what you know of Polynesian culture is polytheistic. It's not monotheistic, which is the background that most Europeans came from. So there was a real struggle when the colonists came and were dealing with trying to Christianize these polytheistic people. But one of the main features that they still retain today is this idea of tapu. So while many of the groups of Maori tribes and almost everyone here has been Christianized, they still retain this idea of tapu, specifically as it relates to their funerals and to cemeteries. Some of the earliest European settlers were missionaries, mostly from Protestant denominations in the Catholic Church. And from the 1830s, most of the Maori began to be converted to Christianity. And as you can see here today, there is still, and you'll see this throughout, you'll still see the cemeteries are very uniquely Maori, that they have a very unique burial style. They still follow the tapu, which is the Polynesian restrictions associated with many of these burial sites. The vast majority of people in New Zealand, both Pakeha and Maori, are non-religious. Almost 50% of the population ascribes themselves to no religion at all. There's also an interesting correlation, not only in New Zealand, but they're seeing this throughout the world as well, that the lack of religion correlates with a higher income, and income correlates with an urban location. So what you end up seeing in Auckland, for example, is that the richest suburbs are often the least religious as well. A wider range of immigrant groups has brought different types of religions, and one of the fastest growing segments right now in New Zealand, actually, among the Maori population is Islam. Almost 48 of New Zealanders reported they had no religion whatsoever, and almost 36 or 37% were Christian. And you can see the others really don't have, there's no answer, and then just others. So this others is a very small category. Now we'll talk briefly about class distinction in New Zealand. There are hierarchies in Maori culture. So while we talk about the Pakeha culture of New Zealand, the European culture being relatively classless, many people would say that that's just the opposite for the Maoris of New Zealand. It is still very stratified according to what the Pakeha traditions would say. A disproportionate number of the Maori members of parliament come from chiefly families. So again, we still see this idea that the wealthy and the powerful continue to retain positions of power even in these minority communities. However, that being said, if you are a person who is not from a chiefly or priestly family, you can, by your own achievements, if you're a good student, if you are a strong worker, if you've done something laudable, you can raise yourself up. You can add more mana to your family name and to your name by doing these good deeds. So in many respects, it's very similar to what we would see in the United States, that wealthy people have their wealth, but if you're a hard worker and you go out and do what you can still have your share of the middle class life. There is consideration, it's widely considered that the Pakeha culture in New Zealand is a classless society. And the reason they say this is because there are several points. The wealthy in society did not make significantly more than the poor people. There was a lack of deference to authority figures in society. There were high levels of class mobility, so you could be born into the lower class and make it to the middle or the upper class. So you weren't restricted because of your class. There's a high standard of worker class living when compared to Britain. So when the people were coming over, they were recognizing, gosh, in this frontier of New Zealand, I can work hard and get ahead that I couldn't do when I was back at home in the UK, in Britain. That I was stuck in class there. If I was a worker, I was always going to be a worker. And here a worker could start his own business, become an entrepreneur, and become a part of the upper class. That was unheard of in British society at the time. Progressive labor laws also protected workers and encouraged unionism. And then there was also a high level of welfare state, both of which were developed in New Zealand before most other countries. New Zealanders' egalitarianism has been criticized as discouraging of entrepreneurialism, denigrating ambition, and individual achievement and success. They would argue with you, of course. Most New Zealanders will tell you that what they admire is a hardworking, honest Joe. They're very much like an average American would say the same thing. Canadians would say the same thing. I think most people would say we're really interested in this working class, honest, hardworking person. And they distrust people who talk about their own merits. Even if you're in the company of someone who might be a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Harvard, and owned 3 or 4 companies, it's one thing for them to say it about you. It's quite another thing for you to say it about yourself. And so the second that you start speaking about yourself to a New Zealander, you'll quickly discover that they turn a deaf ear. They're not interested in hearing about someone who is self-congratulatory. Many Maori argue that ethnicity has now taken the place of class. So while the Pakeha culture says that they're classless, they would say, well, yes, that may be true, but they put the Maori below them in many circumstances. Although the Maori today are fighting back, and they're really making great advances in society. There's been recent changes to the wealth distribution. What used to be a very egalitarian society, now after the 1980s, because of international capital, investment from around the world, and the opening of the New Zealand markets to products from around the world has changed a great deal of things. There's now TV stations from all over the world. Local manufacturing has now suffered because they brought in imports from China and from other parts of the world. And so what we've seen in New Zealand is the same thing that we've seen all over the world, right? When we open up our cultures, there is an automatic downturn in the level of local jobs. Local jobs are lost. Manufacturing goes out of business. This obviously changes over time, but during the short term, what they saw is a real distinction between the wealthy and the poor in New Zealand. It's now very difficult to get a house in New Zealand, to be able to afford a house in New Zealand. Housing prices have gone up dramatically. In fact, now as a foreigner, you are not allowed to purchase property in New Zealand unless you become a resident or a citizen. And the average price of a home in Auckland now is almost $600,000 US. It's the country's most expensive. The cheapest housing can be found on the Western Shores at about $150,000. Travel-wise, New Zealanders love to travel. They love to get out and see the world. They get their passport stamp. One of the things that's very common for those of you who are from Europe, there's this idea of the gap year, which is common for students after the age of 18. In New Zealand, from 18 and sometimes through 21, they will take this time as OE or overseas experience, and they will go to Europe, they'll go to Asia. Many of these people now are taking jobs for many years in Australia or in Asia, teaching, and then they come back and they continue with their schooling, or they start into the workforce. When we think of New Zealanders, we have a very specific stereotype in mind. And so this is something that you'll see throughout New Zealand. This is Ollie the lad. This is his first beer, as you can see here in his right hand, and his secondary beer is there in his left hand for whoever needs it. But this idea is that they're handy, they're clever people, they're people of the land, and people who you definitely want to be around. A New Zealander's the kind of person you want to invite to your party, is basically what they're saying. And the Kiwi male is known as someone who has a solution for everything. When you picture a New Zealand male, many people think of someone who's working on a sheep shearing farm or someone who's working in the countryside. And that is very much an atypical stereotype because most New Zealanders do live in the major cities. They're very conservative. They're progressive in some social areas, but they also have a streak of conservatism. New Zealand was the first country to have an openly transgender mayor and later a member of parliament, Georgina Bear. Same-sex marriage has been legal in New Zealand since 2013. And yet there's also been some economic and political policies that have been very conservative. For example, until 1967, pubs were closed at 6 p.m. Businesses were not open on weekends until 1999, and alcoholic beverages could not be sold on Sunday at all. Abortion is still restricted, more restricted in New Zealand than it is in most other Western societies. Turnout for elections is very high, despite the fact that people are not mandated to go to these elections. But local elections, the voter turnout is low, about 53%. That still beats US voter turnout by quite a lot. New Zealanders, both of Pakeha and Maori roots, have been described as individualistic people. They also highly prize their land. The Maori because they are people of the land, and obviously the British people because they understand the value of that land and they want to retain it. So there's a very high emphasis on property rights in New Zealand. In addition, the Maori have a significance that's deeper than just money. It's their spiritual significance that they also attach to the land. For most of New Zealand's history, the past 200 years, it's been a bicultural society. And they're now struggling, as many cultures are, whether it's the UK, whether it's Canada, the United States, or any country around the world now, struggling with how to face their society in this age of multiculturalism. How do they hold on to their traditions while still opening their doors and allowing other traditions to come and take root? You won't go hungry while you're in New Zealand. They have lovely seafood, and if you enjoy lamb, you're in for a real treat. If you enjoy mutton, you'd be the first person I've ever met. And that's what I had during most of my time in New Zealand, so I will not touch a piece of it ever again. I have no interest in any sort of mutton whatsoever. But the key ingredients of their diet are sweet potato, fern root, taro, birds and fish. In the past, they cooked their meals in a hangi. They still do this. This is a very traditional sort of a barbecue that they'll have for special occasions. So a baptism, a marriage, or even a funeral will be a hangi. Maori were one of the few native peoples to never have a form of alcoholic beverage. So they drink less than their counterparts, but because they don't have a physical tolerance for it, when they do drink, similar to Native Americans and other types of native tribes, it also affects their biology much more quickly than the Pakeha culture. Following the arrival of the British settlers, Maori adopted to many of the British foods, and they took on a liking particularly to the potato, and they also eat a fair amount of meat. So both the Pakeha culture and the Maori culture eat a fair amount of chicken and pork and fish. It's very easy today. One of the things that people do often is called the boil up, which is where they take their leftover meats and they mix it together with vegetables, and this becomes the second night's meal. And the other thing, as I talked about, which is the hangi, which is associated with special occasions. It's like throwing a really special pig roast for your family, and this is a very special time for Maori families and even for Pakeha families today. There's a big connection between, obviously, Pakeha cuisine and British cuisine. And so British, as you'll find throughout New Zealand, there's a heavy British influence. You'll find the fish and chips. You'll find many of the same recipes that you'll see in Britain. You'll find these throughout. Dessert bars and pavlova. This is a lychee and ginger pavlova, which is lovely. But you can find a lot of really good desserts because the Pakeha here really love their desserts. New Zealand chefs such as Peter Gordon have played an important role. So for those of you who are going to spend a little bit more time in Auckland, there's some wonderful restaurants. If you decide to go out and enjoy some fine dining, look up ahead of time and go out. There's a lot of really wonderful restaurants to get away for a little bit and have a nice night on the town. There's also a large number of international cuisines that you'll find throughout Auckland as well. You won't find it in many other places, but definitely in Auckland. There's also a strong coffee culture, so you can, if you just have to go to a Starbucks, okay, but otherwise there's lots and lots of really great little coffee shops. Talk briefly about what to expect in New Zealand. Expect to spend some money. It's expensive in New Zealand. Almost everything is more expensive than what you're used to, except for those of you who maybe come from Scandinavian countries where it will be very similar. But for those of you coming from the United States and Canada, you can expect to pay almost double for things in restaurants. You can expect to pay more than double for gas at the pump. Even things that are locally produced and sourced are still more expensive in New Zealand. Efficiency is prized. You'll find that people are very no-nonsense in New Zealand. If you decide that New Zealand's a place that you'd like to consider living and you're a person with very little patience, New Zealand is the place for you because they have very little patience for nonsense as well. They expect that things are going to get done quickly and efficiently, and if you're not going to do it, they're not going to tolerate it. They're going to let you know straight away. In New Zealand, most of the things that would take several days to do in other cultures, such as maybe transferring bank accounts or getting utilities set up, this can all be done very quickly in New Zealand. Even though many of these places that you're going to visit have freezing temperatures throughout the winter, you'll be amazed to know that most New Zealanders do not have central heating in their home. They only heat the rooms that they're in while they're in them. They won't heat their hallways, they won't heat their living rooms. So in many respects, when you go into these homes, they have the windows that provide the heat with the sunshine coming through, but they don't have central heating, so they believe in just heating the house one room at a time. It's hard to make friends with Kiwis. I learned this in my time there. They're lovely people. They will take the time to help you. They will guide you. They will pick you up on the side of the road. But most Kiwis that you will meet have enough friends. They don't need any more. You will not find a lot of Kiwis keen on striking up a long conversation. And so if you ask someone, "How are you?" in New Zealand, expect a very quick answer because they're not interested in hearing about your troubles any more than you're interested in hearing about theirs. New Zealanders have an inferiority complex in some respects, and that means not for them personally, but because they come from a small country that's been isolated, they really struggle to let people know who they are and why they should be interested in New Zealand culture. So if you do get an opportunity, ask them about their culture, ask them what they value, talk with them about the things that are important to them if they give you the time of day. Extreme sports. I did my first bungee jump from this bridge when I was 21 years old, and you can still do it today. I see a lot of people who look like they want to do it. Maybe I don't see that many people. But You can do this and they'll actually dip you right into the river and pull you right back up again. They have jet boating. You can do skydiving. If it's something that involves adrenaline, Kiwis love to do it. As I mentioned before, please don't compare the Kiwis to Australians. They're not interested in the comparison. Also, while their flags are similar and their accent may be similar to those of you who can't hear the difference, and sometimes I can't either, Kiwis do not appreciate being compared to Australians. For those of you who've watched The Hobbit and know that much of it was filmed here and Peter Jackson is from here, please do not mention this. You won't find any homes for hobbits here. Actually, you're much more likely to find that in Guatemala, where there's actually a little town that's made up of houses in the hills that's basically a little hobbit village. If you're interested, I'll tell you about it. It's called Hobbitenango in Guatemala. They are straight talkers, the Kiwis. If you ask them a question, expect a straight answer, and if you make them upset, expect them to tell you straight away. They're obsessed with rugby. Don't ask me, ask them. This is the one way to make friends in New Zealand. If you have trouble getting a conversation started, ask them about their rugby teams. Now, I can't leave this lecture without a joke. This is my trademark, right? And for those of you who have heard about New Zealand, you've heard about jokes probably about how many sheep there are in New Zealand compared to how many people there are. There's almost twice to 4 times as many sheep in New Zealand as there are people. And so this has led to a good number of jokes, much at the New Zealander, the Kiwi male's expense. And so this is a joke that starts off with an Australian coming to New Zealand, and he's a ventriloquist. And so he sees this guy sitting on his front porch, and he's got a dog alongside of him, and he comes over to the guy and he says, figures he's going to have a little fun. He says, well, pardon me, do you mind if I talk with your dog? And the Kiwi looks at him and says, yeah, go on, mate. And so the Australian says, well, hey, buddy, how you doing today? How's that guy taking care of you? And the dog speaks back and he says, well, you know, I've been treated better. I could be taken out for more walks, and I get generally 3 square meals a day, and everything's pretty good, but I could use a little more exercise. Boy, and the New Zealander looks at him and says, you know, this is pretty impressive. I didn't know my dog could talk. And so the Australian says, hey, you mind if I go over and talk to your horse? And the guy says, sure, I didn't know I had a talking dog. Let's see if the horse talks. And so he starts talking to the horse. He says, how you doing, buddy? Oh, I'm pretty good. I get my carrots and my apples, and you know, he beats me a little hard when he's out taking me for a ride, but pretty much things are good here. And the Australian's on a roll now. He's got this guy, this New Zealander, pretty well perplexed. And so he says to him, hey, do you mind if I go over and talk to your sheep? He says, don't listen to a damn thing that sheep has to say.